Welcome to panel session number 1. This panel will be moderated by Commander Wallace. Thank you.
So good morning. My name is Commander Dave Wallace. I'm a leadership professor here at the Academy, and much more distinguished is our panel here. Dr. Dennis O'Neill, he is, Deputy Fire Administrator for the U.S. Fire Service. Dr. Loren Mayor, she's the President of Operations for NPR. Mr. Mike Steadman, who was a Marine Corps infantry officer and currently leads Iron Boxing, a boxing outfit in Newark, New Jersey. And Captain Charlie Plumb, who among other pieces of his distinguished career was a POW in Vietnam. And probably the highlight of his career was when he spoke at a Forrestal lecture when I was a midshipman some 20-some-odd years ago. A wealth and variety of experience here to talk to us about our panel discussion here on bringing out the best in people. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to start with just kind of a connection of our leadership journey. And I'm curious for each of you, and for each of us, I know we're all here at the leadership conference. We volunteered to come here. We have some idea that we are interested and want to be leaders. That comes at different times for different people throughout their life. And so I'm curious for each of you, when was the time or series of times or moments when you made some sort of transition from I'm just a person running through my life and doing cool things to, leadership is a really interesting thing and maybe a calling for me. So Dr. O'Neill, I'll start with you.
One of the things that you're probably waiting to hear about is the GPS to life. How did you get there? When did you decide at age 5 that you wanted to be the Deputy United States Fire Administrator? Was it when you were 5 or when you were 6? And the answer was, I never thought I'd be here. And I suspect that most men and women who are in responsible positions of responsibility will tell you the same. Somewhere around the time I was about 26 or 27, 28 years old, when I began a career in the fire and emergency services, and I was responsible for the lives of a number of men at the time. You were fighting, it was a fire department, so you were leading men into situations that threaten their lives every day. That was what you did when you went to work that day. And I was just concerned about the possibility that they would be injured and killed, and the men that I was working with, the superiors that I had at the time, didn't impress me, and my belief was, if I step up, maybe I can make it a little better.
Interesting. Dr. Mayor?
Hi, I'm so honored to be here today. I've had a fairly varied career path, but I actually started with a love of theater. And all I ever wanted to do was put on a show, was be part of a team, part of a group that was, just working towards a common goal. My favorite moment is when the show's going to go on the next day and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and the sets aren't done and the costumes aren't fully sewed and everybody's up all night to work together to get the thing done that you all believe in. And that feeling of camaraderie and teamwork, that actually at some point I realized that's what I love. I want to be part of a group. And it wasn't necessarily that I started out wanting to lead that group. I just wanted to be part of people all committed to the same mission or vision. And at some point I also realized I'm pretty organized and good at getting us over the finish line, and I'm just going to keep doing that. But it wasn't that I wanted to lead, it was that I wanted to be part of that community.
Interesting. All right, Mr. Steadman?
So I just have to acknowledge I'm getting goosebumps sitting next to Captain Plumb here because he talked to me when I was a plebe. So I'm super honored to be up among this panel. I think I always had leadership aspirations, but it really wasn't until I graduated the Naval Academy and became an infantry officer in the Marines and really went to Afghanistan and had that Marine Corps experience where I was leadership was pretty much thrust upon me. And at that point, you couldn't really hide from it anymore. So, coming from a place like this and then having that background, anything I do in life, I'm constantly put in a leadership position. And just because of, like I said, the background, and really just learning how to embrace that. So I think it went from having leadership aspirations to people see me as a leader regardless, and really just embracing that to move forward and work with young men of color in a place like Newark, New Jersey.
Awesome.
I'm not sure I knew the definition of leadership until I sat in one of those seats that you're sitting in. At age 17, had to learn reef points. For those non-Naval Academy folks, reef points is a little book about that big, and we were forced to memorize a lot in reef points. What I remember from those days and what has been a filter on my life when I look for leadership is John Paul Jones, who said the qualifications of a naval officer. He said it's by no means enough that an officer of the Navy be a capable mariner. And for you civilians in the crowd, this means, yes, you have a baseline knowledge, but that's not enough. He should be as well a gentleman of liberal education, refined manners, punctilious courtesy, and the nicest sense of personal honor. No meritorious act should go without his reward. He said, and he should be quick and unfailing to distinguish, listen to this, error from malice, thoughtlessness from incompetency, and well-meant shortcomings from stupid or heedless blunder. Well, that quote ran through my mind 1,000 times in the 6 years I was a prisoner of war, watching guys like Jim Stockdale and John McCain and Jeremiah Denton, 3 Naval Academy graduates, who knew the same quote and had the same filter on leadership. And so to me, that was the baptism of fire, and really the culmination, well, not the culmination, but the validation of the things that I thought I knew about leadership was watching these guys under so much pressure with trying to lead a group of people that they couldn't see, they couldn't fire, they couldn't hire, they couldn't pull their liberty cards. That was the leadership that I saw in the prison camps.
It's interesting. And so, yeah, when we think about leadership, right, over the course of our careers, I think we see that our definition of leadership changes, right? So we start in one place where a leader is really this individual. We have this, understanding that, oh, the leader gets their own table and they get, the big pay and they get everything else. And then maybe there's a change there about, leadership is really about what the followers do, right? And about getting people all rowing in the same direction and getting a team together. And so I guess I'm curious, so, that's fascinating. I'm curious, so Dr. Mayor, how did that go for you, this idea of this change in idea of what it even means, once you are a leader, what it means to be a leader?
Well, I'll use a specific example, I think, just to help. One of the more difficult leadership challenges that I've had to deal with recently was, we're living in this Me Too movement, and a little over a year ago at NPR, which is where I am now, we had a sexual harassment scandal where the senior-most person in our newsroom, our head of all of our news coverage, was accused of sexual harassment and fired. And it was devastating for the organization. When it first emerged, one of the things that was shocking to me was I really had no idea. I had a thought about what our culture was and what was going on, and I was clearly wrong about what was happening. And it opened up this sort of wellspring of just anger throughout the organization and this deep sense that a lot of people in the company had that didn't have to do with sexual harassment, but which really had to do with power dynamics, and a deep sense that they felt like things weren't fair, that people with the least amount of power in the organization were treated in one way, and people with the most amount of power were treated another. And when all of this came out, it sort of landed on my shoulders. I have a boss who's the CEO. He was out on medical leave, and so I was the leader of the organization at the time. And it was a little overwhelming just to feel an entire organization feel like it was rupturing. And so what I ended up doing was recognizing that, just because you think, oh, the leader in a corner office, they're going to have all the answers, they're going to know the path, they're going to know what to do, I wasn't sure. And so what I did instead was to sort of flip the situation and to listen. What I did in our organization was I held, I'm not a marketer, so I call them listening sessions. And I met with groups of no more than 20 employees at a time. We're about a 1,000-person company, for an hour, and I just said, tell me what's on your mind, tell me what's wrong, and if you feel able, tell me if you have any thoughts about what we should be doing. And I did that hour after hour, day after day, week after week, and just took in from the organization. And so I sort of rebuilt community from the bottom up and recognized that I didn't have the answers, that I had to really be attuned to what was happening in the organization to find the path forward.
Wow, that's interesting. So now I'm just curious, where did that idea even come from to have just those small group sessions?
Either a flash of inspiration or a flash of desperation. I didn't know what the answer was.
Right.
And, as I said before, I'm somebody who leans into collaboration. I always believe you're going to get a better answer if you're surrounded by smart people and you're asking them for their opinions. And so it was sort of my default, and that's what I did. And it was, I think what was powerful for others in the company was, so I spent several weeks just listening to people. And then what I did was I just tried to synthesize what I'd heard. And I called an all-staff meeting about a month after, so our scandal broke. And I just stood in front of our whole company and said, I've been listening, and now I'm going to just share what I heard. And I'm not going to make value judgments. I'm not going to defend it. I'm going to share with you what I've heard across the organization, and then I'm going to outline the steps that I think we need to take to go forward, that I've heard from all of you. And there was something incredibly powerful and moving, I think, for people in the organization to hear their pain and their frustration sort of echoed back at them, particularly said from somebody in a leadership position, validating that sense of anger and betrayal and hurt and really giving it a voice. And because we were able to sort of bring that all out in the open and acknowledge it, it did actually let us move forward as an organization. And I had this realization after the fact, which is at NPR, we believe that listening changes the world. That's sort of our mission statement, right? We believe that if you listen to your radio or your podcast, it's going to give you the information to make you a better person, a better citizen, and really, change the future. And I hadn't fully realized that listening also changes organizations, that if you can do that inside your company, you can have the same kind of impact.
So speaking of unprecedented situations where people are worried about power dynamics, Dr. O'Neill is in the middle of a government shutdown in his organization, and we were talking earlier about the prospect of a large part of his organization at some point coming back, and how we prepare for that. So again, completely unprecedented. We've never been here before. I'm curious about how you're facing that and how you work with that with your team.
I'm going to use the metaphor that perhaps the Navy would use. And what I'm going back to is an aircraft carrier that hasn't moved, in this case for 30 days, but to make it more dramatic, hasn't moved in a year. And I'm taking on a crew that is perhaps angry because in many cases they've had to go on unemployment insurance. They're late with their creditors. They've got 3 kids with crooked teeth that want to go to college, and their economic stability in their families have now been threatened. In many cases, they feel as if either the legislative or executive branch of the government has let them down. They've made a value judgment on their mission. So I'm assembling the senior managers of our organization to make sure, starting tomorrow, I don't know when we're going to go back to work, but to make sure that we're all on the same page as to the strategy that we're going to be using over the next probably 4 to 6 weeks to get everybody's head back in the game, to get this ship cleaned up and in ship shape and back out on mission. We're going into hurricane season. We're going into wildfire season. There's going to be a lot of Americans who will be threatened, and we have to make sure that the men and women are doing that. The benefit that I have is that the men and women with whom I work are all in the 07, 08, 09 pay grades. So their opinions and their experiences, even though they've never faced something like this before, they have a lot of experience, and we're going to get this done.
Fascinating. So now we get to the even more extreme of the didn't expect to be here, and the world is upside down now. Captain Plumb, you certainly found yourself in that situation with people with whom, some who maybe you knew and many who you didn't know, and now you're charged with building a largely covert organization in a completely unique circumstance. And I'm curious how you felt you were prepared for that and how that changed you and how you went forward from there.
Totally unprepared. As a matter of fact, I was 24 years old, Lieutenant JG, when I was shot down. Let me go to a little more of the historical part, though. 591 of us came home at the end of the war. 591, not a big crowd. The psychiatrists and psychologists thought we'd be vegetables. What can you expect? 6, 7, 8.5 years in a prison camp. They had our families briefed to institutionalize us the rest of our lives. That's what they thought was coming home from Vietnam. We're setting records now. From 591 men, we produced 17 generals and 7 admirals. We have congressmen, 2 United States senators, 2 ambassadors from our number, a vice presidential candidate, a presidential candidate, and they're telling us we're healthier today mentally and physically than if we hadn't been shot down. So what's the difference? And people smarter than I am tell us that was primarily the leadership we had in the prison camp. As fighter pilots, you're not supposed to get shot down, and you're not supposed to surrender. And to a man, we had all been shot down, and we had all surrendered. And the mood in that prison camp was one of terrible defeat, loneliness, frustration. Largely, we felt guilty. How can I ever go back to my country, you know, and be with the family when I have to admit that I failed so miserably? And that was the gang that was in that prison camp when Jim Stockdale showed up. He was commander of the air group. We called him CAG. He showed up and turned that whole situation around, and he said, "We're not on the defensive here. We're not victims of circumstance here. We are warriors. We will pursue this war to our last dying breath. So pull up your big boy pants. Let's get on with it." And it was really interesting the way the mission led the entire unity of that prison camp. And I felt like when he took command that I was on the best team I'd ever play on, and it was. And I watched the best leadership I'd ever seen. These guys that had very little control on the lives of their followers, and yet inspired us by the courage that they had to lead, and by the integrity that they had, and the transparency that they all had. These leaders, they took command in a very difficult situation. A study was done just a few years ago of all the combatants of Vietnam. 30.6% have PTSD, about a third PTSD. Of the prisoners of war, 4% of us have PTSD. And it's primarily the guys that were shot down near the end of the war, only prisoners for a few weeks or a month or two. And I think any of us that you see will credit CAG, James Bond Stockdale, for our survival and even thriving through that situation.
So, Mr. Steadman, you have kind of even a different perspective, right? Because the changes that you're trying to make and the leadership you're trying to show is not just within your organization, but within the larger community. And so I'm curious how you got there, right? So you came from being a Marine Corps infantry officer in Afghanistan, and now here you are changing lives, again, not just of your employees, but of the surrounding community. How does that change your ideas on leadership, or how did your changing ideas on leadership bring you there?
So I like to talk about culture, right? So just to put it in perspective, I founded the Ironbound Boxing Academy in 2017 in Newark, New Jersey, which is one of the most dangerous cities in the country. And so you want to talk about counterculture, you know, coming from an environment like the Naval Academy where it's honor, courage, and commitment, and going into an environment like Newark where that's not necessarily the case, but rallying a community around, you know, this vision of providing free recreation to inner city youth and young adults around boxing. You asked me how I got to Newark. Well, I was fortunate enough to win 3 national championships as a light heavyweight here in Navy. And I like to tell people you don't win 3 national championships sparring a bunch of midshipmen, right? So I spent my time in inner city gyms in Baltimore, D.C., and New York City. And what I realized, my teammates and I, boxing was just a stepping stone for us. We're going to go be officers, and we had aspirations to get, our degrees and MBAs, lawyers, leaders of industry, starting our own businesses. But I would go to these inner city gyms, and a lot of the kids in there, they were literally just looking for an opportunity to escape the streets. So my initial intent of moving to Newark was, how do I take the best of the Naval Academy boxing program and all the Service Academy boxing programs and bring it into an environment like Newark? Yesterday, Colonel Athens talked a lot about these concept of values and culture. And so for anybody that has aspirations to be an entrepreneur, I can't stress how important that is. Now, the difference in Newark is these aren't values that I can necessarily write down and say, hey, community, this is what we represent. I have to more, live it and be transparent with it. So, like right now, I have a guy running my gym right now who's an ex-con, right? So while I was at the Naval Academy, he was serving a federal sentence. All my coaches are volunteers, and they've all been incarcerated at some point. And then you have me coming into this environment trying to rally support for this boxing program. And, one of my values, I think, is it's about the kids, right? It's very simple. And there's nothing I can just write down. It's something I have to live through my actions. So I going into an environment like Newark, when I'm not from there, I don't have any family there, and I'm trying to get this boxing program going, I said, okay, they're going to be very observant of my actions and what I do. So everything I've done as far as making actions for the kids and every decisions I made for the kids, the people around me who see that, right, then that's something that they can also rally around and that they want to get behind as well. So in an environment, working with young men of color, working in an environment like Newark, it's all about living it, which I think is important. We talk about this, inside-out leadership. And in an environment like that, I have to represent it more than anything else.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, all right, that's 2 in a row. We've now talked about transparency, right? And this idea, that's a great way to put it, of living it, right? And of building that credibility, being able to come in and not just walk in as, well, I'm the 4-striper here, so I get to just declare what's going to happen, right? Or here I come, I'm a Naval Academy grad, therefore I can tell you all how to be. But to actually, to build that credibility through transparency and through being open probably about your faults and about what could go wrong and everything else. And so, Dr. O'Neill, you also came up in Jersey City as part of your earlier career, and you were telling me about how that kind of formed that in that same way, where that transparency became really important.
Thank you. There was a time in my life when I had more friends in federal prison than I had saying Mass on Sunday. And I always found that it was much, much easier to be 100% ethical than it was to be 99% ethical. Because if you're only 99% ethical, you have to make a decision every time. But if you're 100% ethical, you only don't have to make a decision at all. It's a real easy decision to make. With regard to transparency, I have a little saying that I say to myself, demonstrate your leadership style and only use words if you have to. So it's not something that you say when you come in and I got 4 stripes or whatever ranks you are, but what you do. People, I think it was Maya Angelou who said, people may remember what you say, they may remember what you do, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. So soliciting input, the lowest rank with the least experience may give you some insights about how to be a success in whatever project that you're working on. But that shiny badge and that rank can sometimes blind you. So I always viewed leadership not as a position of privilege, not as a position of authority, but as a position of responsibility. That no matter what happened, we heard Colonel Athens last night talk about Velcro and Teflon. You've got to be, when there's a problem, you've got to be Velcro. You've got to take that, whatever the problem is, the first statement out of my mouth is, that's my fault, let's fix it.
Interesting. And so, Dr. Mayor, you kind of started off this conversation about the transparency and having those listening groups and really listening. So now I'm curious about the other side of that, right? So there are times when the listening is over, and it's time to, we're going to color now, and this is a direction. Certainly, if you're going to change the culture of an organization, you have to have a vision, and you have to be able to get people on board with that vision. And so I'm curious about your struggles, particularly with people who did not agree with your vision. And I can imagine you're breaking up power structures. There's going to be a lot of resistance to that. How did you deal with that while still maintaining that transparency and that ability to listen?
So two things come to mind. One, I think that you have to be, a word I would put with transparency is authenticity. You just have to be yourself in every setting. And if you're not, people sense it. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting to try to pretend to be something different from who you are. And so I think sort of bringing your authentic self into every setting is really important if you're going to thrive. I think it's interesting. You said it's not what you say, it's about what you do. But what I found actually was that it was about doing the right thing, but it was also about saying the right thing. That people do listen, and if what you talk about, so I work in a journalism organization, if what you talk about is the journalism, people know the journalism is important, and that's what we had done. We hadn't talked about how we wanted to behave as a culture. It just wasn't part of the language and the vocabulary. And so part of what I found I had to do was actually talk about it all the time. I started a year ago, and I still do. I send a weekly note to the entire staff about how we're trying to work on the culture this week. And because I talk about it all the time, I don't let anybody forget that that's what we're doing and that that's what's important. And so part of it is about putting out the roadmap and saying that this is where we're going, and then demonstrating step after step that you're getting there.
Interesting. And so I'm guessing, Mr. Steadman, you probably have similar experience, people who, especially early on, right, resist what you're trying to do. It's maybe a little easier now that you've built some credibility, but in the early days, trying to build credibility and coming in, and certainly walking the walk will get us there to an extent, but how did you deal with that in the early moments of people questioning what you were trying to do and if that was even the right thing?
So I made a pretty calculated decision early on about having a constant presence in the community. And to be honest, I mean, a lot of times they still don't trust me, right? Because I'm an outsider. What's his angle, right? Like, this guy's moving to Newark. He's starting this gym. Is he trying to make money on it? Like, what's going on, right? Because they don't have the values we teach. They don't go to leadership conferences like we're holding right here. And I think the way that I was able to counter that is doing everything I could to show that I was part of the community. So not only participating in, boxing events, but making myself available for other volunteer events, right? More recently, living in Newark, right? So Newark is 90% Black and Latino. 40% of our population lives below the poverty line, and 1 in 5 jobs in the city actually go to Newark residents. So to be honest, most of the people with my background, as far as education-wise, tend not to live in the city of Newark, right? I made a calculated decision to move there to work at a private school, St. Benedict's, which is here in the house. But when I left that job, I decided to stay in the city of Newark. And the goal was there was a lot cheaper places I could have moved, a nicer quality of life. But if I'm going to have this boxing gym in Newark and I'm going to be about the community, it's important for me to be seen and important for me to be present in the community. So that way, when I interact with the kids, they know where to find me. They know, hey, Coach lives in town. He doesn't live out in the suburbs. And so doing that, I think, has allowed me to get credibility with the young men and women that I'm serving, but also the people that are watching me and waiting me to slip up. It's like they haven't quite figured me out yet, but I think I'm starting to gain some traction.
Yeah. Wow. And so, Captain Plumb, you probably have the most obvious and stark example of people who are working against you, right? You were a prisoner with prison guards, people who were the enemy. And now, we hear stories over time of how that relationship changes over time. And I'm curious how this with this discussion of authenticity and transparency, and how that relationship has changed over time.
It didn't take me very long to realize that I had to forgive the prison guards. Tough thing to do, really, because the first several months in that situation, I was so angry one of the, one of the height of anger was when a young guard, probably a teenager, his rifle and the bayonet were taller than he was, and he brought his girlfriend into the prison camp to show her how tough he was, how he could beat up an American. And so I lay on the floor, bleeding from 4 places with no medical care, as this kid, beat me up. And I was so angry, so bitter towards this guy. And I finally got communication with some of the other prisoners, which was a godsend. I mean, it was life or death just to communicate with the other guys. And we passed around Bible verses and patriotic quotes and qualifications of a naval officer and those kinds of things we just for something to do. But one of the quotes that he passed along to me was this: acid does more harm in the vessel it's stored than on the subject it's poured. Well, that meant to me that my bitterness and angry and vitriol was killing me. It wasn't hurting the enemy at all. In fact, they were happy about that. And if I was going to survive this and even thrive because of this negative experience, I was going to have to forgive these guys and forgive myself, for having failed in my mission. And that change was quite a metamorphosis for me to realize that, yes, I still had control of my response. I couldn't control what those guards were doing to me, but I could certainly control the way I responded to that. And it was a lifesaver. It changed over that. I went back to Vietnam just 3 years ago. I was invited back there by the head of the history department at Hanoi University. And I met the camp commander, the guy who was in charge of all of our torture. And I met some of the other fighter pilots that I'd gotten into dogfights with. And it was really an interesting experience because, after all these years, there was no hate, there was no bitterness, there was no, it was, warriors talking to warriors that had been involved at one time in trying to kill each other, and just because we felt that we were good warriors. So the transition has occurred, but it was early on in the experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that fits in with this discussion, transparency and authenticity. And one of the things that I've certainly heard Colonel Athens speak before, and one of the things that he speaks about is leadership coming from a place of love, right? And that's got to be the base. I think each of you have kind of touched on that, whether it's listening, whether it's realizing that you need to help out, your fellow firefighters, whether it's being concerned about these kids or your fellow prisoners. It's this idea that you're starting from a place of love and then building on that in what we're doing. So, look, we've each talked about now some transformational experience or experiences that we've had over the course of our career and how we're now someplace we never thought we would be early on. And so I'm kind of ask us to come around full circle, and I'll start with you, Dr. O'Neill. Your 17-year-old self, right? What's the advice? What did he do right, or what did he do wrong that you might push him in a different direction now?
Wow. Commander, I realize that we're in a place with men and women who love the military, who want to be leaders in the military, but I was drafted in the largest draft call-up in the Vietnam War, May of 1967, and I was a corporal, so everybody in this room outranks me. I think getting over some of that anger and some of that wise guy stuff, and it's a journey. It's not a step. It's not a switch that you turn on and off. But learning that God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, that it's important to listen, and it's important to listen. And I was talking to General over here, and it's important to listen to understand as opposed to listen to respond. When people are talking to you, making sure that you understand their position, because if you do, when you're in your mid to career or the senior level in the organization, if you're listening to understand, people will tell you things that you need to know to be successful. You don't know it all. There's something going on in your organization that you don't know about that's going to sink your ship or ruin your career if you don't listen. And there's plenty of examples of that in the Navy. There's plenty of examples of that in the fire service. There's plenty of that in the federal government. listen to understand.
So, Dr. Mayor, how about young Miss Mayor?
So one of the funny things is actually the me I feel like on the inside probably is even younger than that 17-year-old self, right? Like I still walk through the world basically, like my inner view of you is that I'm just this 13-year-old, very nerdy person trying to sort of navigate the world. And what's been fascinating is recognizing that that is not how I am seen from the outside, that actually, it's shocking to me actually. But you know, in my organization, I walk in and I'm the boss, and that is how people see me, and that is the lens that they put on me all the time. And so that disconnect, it actually took me a long time to figure it out. If you'll indulge me, just a small story. When all of this sort of crisis went on in my company, I had a young woman come and talk to me and talk about how angry she was and what I should do. And it was a good conversation. She left. I followed her advice, and she came back maybe a week later, and she said, I just want you to know I was so upset that you didn't tell me that I was brave to come and talk to you. And she was a really kind of fierce, tough young lady, and I was pretty intimidated actually in this whole conversation. And the thought, I realized I didn't tell you you were brave because it didn't occur to me, right? I just thought you were coming to talk to like 13-year-old dorky me, and yet you were coming to talk to the head of this organization, and that was brave. And so you need to recognize that as a leader, who you are in the world and how you come across. But if I went back, if I could go back to my younger self that I still feel, I think I wanted to have a plan. I looked at my friends and colleagues who seemed to know exactly what they were going to do. They were going to be a doctor. They sort of had this clear vision, and I didn't have one. And that was very unsettling. And I wish I could tell that person, you know, if you do what you love, good things come from it. My mother's piece of advice to me was a quote that I think is Albert Einstein, but I'm not sure, which is that chance favors the well-prepared mind. And that's been very helpful for me, that if you're doing what you love and you're open to new opportunities, that good things will come from it. And my own career path has been pretty zig and zaggy, but because I've been doing what I loved at each step of the way, it's led me to the next thing that has also been really gratifying for me.
Yeah, that's great. How about you, Mr. Steadman?
So I think for me, it would be forgiveness, right? So I like to, I'm a way better entrepreneur than I ever was as a junior officer. I'm just gonna be completely honest. But I'm just now getting to the point where I can look back at my life and forgive myself for some of the decisions I made. So, you know, it's one thing to forgive other people, but a lot of time we're so critical of ourselves, especially, you know, trying to be a high achiever, that, you know, I was a 24-year-old platoon commander leading men into combat for the first time, right? I made good decisions, I made bad decisions, but I always think about the bad decisions. But now the success I've received with like Ironbound and everything else I'm doing moving forward are because of the decisions I made as a platoon commander. So looking back at those decisions and saying, hey, you know what, I forgive myself because had I not made those decisions, I wouldn't be where I'm at now, and I wouldn't have the experience to get me where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, so not just forgiving others, but forgiving yourself.
Yes, self-forgive. I can't stress enough because, especially as you start to get older, as a leader, you're constantly going to be under the bus. Like we talked about it before we came down here. You know, a lot of people are worried about uncertainty, and the challenge of being a leader is you're going to have to make the decision regardless of whether or not you know the outcome. And a lot of times those decisions are going to be wrong, but you made the decision anyway. And so accepting that and moving on from it instead of just constantly thinking about like, man, I should have went left, you know, when I decided to go right. Like it's constantly there, but I'm telling you, you just look back and say, hey man, just, you know, I was young. I made a decision I didn't know. Now, I don't want to make that same decision.
So, Captain Plumb, I'm going to change it up for you a little bit.
No.
Yeah.
My response was already ready.
I know, that's why I'm changing it. So instead of your 17-year-old self to prepare you for your experience in Vietnam, I'm curious about your 25, 26-year-old self coming out of that experience. What you would tell him that has brought you now to here?
Good question. I think I would tell myself at age 30 when I came out to stand on my confidence. And I'm sure that there's that many of you feel like you're going into a world that you're not going to understand, that you're brand new, that you're ignorant in a lot of the ways of the world. And even though I'd been through that experience and I recognized what worked and what didn't work, I still was not really ready to get into the civilian world. I had my life planned out. I had planned my life out three different ways, as a matter of fact, while I was a prisoner. The next 20 years, I was always in the military. You know, it was what duty stations, what planes I'd fly, the things I'd do. I married my high school sweetheart, and it was all built around her and our time together in the Navy. She had filed for divorce 3 months before I was released from prison. And so I came back to a world that I didn't know, you know, what was going to happen. And the decisions that I started making then were going to affect the rest of my life. And I remember just praying for the confidence that it would take to make those decisions. And I think, you know, from young leaders, that's really, I mean, if I could give anyone in here a pill, it would be that of self-confidence. If you can really believe in who you are and what you do, and recognize that, sure, we all have wrinkles, we all have pimples, but oh, by the way, we come from a very good baseline, and you should use that foundation, you know, to give yourself that kind of self-confidence. And so I think that's probably what I would tell myself at age 30.
So my watch just told me it's time to stand. So we're, and more importantly, this is obviously a fascinating, interesting discussion. But I think, you know, the real meat and engagement that you all are going to get is in the breakout sessions that follow. Now, each of our panelists has offered to go over with you to the breakout sessions and to sit and talk with some of you at the breakout tables. And I think that's going to be a really great way to engage the subject matter and talk to each other about what you heard and what that means in your own life and your own leadership journey. So I would like to thank each of our panel members. That was a great discussion. Thank you very much.